And of course, bringing the history up to more recent time, if people even studied closely the history of the Vietnam War, that wasn't that long ago, was it? There are actually people here who remember the Vietnam War. Despite the attempts of the media to forget the Vietnam War, despite the attempts of our political leaders, when we went into Iraq the first time in 1991 and won this quick, smashing victory, a splendid little war, just like the Spanish-American War, a very quick, victorious war, and George Bush said, Senior, that's the smarter one. George Bush Senior said, well, we have now buried the Vietnam syndrome in the sands of the Arabian Peninsula. A rare poetic statement out of the White House. Well, the fact is we have not buried the Vietnam syndrome. Vietnam is coming back to haunt us, and people are thinking about that more and more every day. And if people remembered Vietnam, they would remember how the calls for withdrawal that came early on. I must say, in 1967, 2 years after we were escalating the war, in 1967, I wrote a book. I love to advertise my books. I'll try to resist it later on, but I can't resist this one. In 1967, I wrote a book called Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal. And mine was, I must say, the first book. There had been a number of books on the war in Vietnam, and mine was the first book that called simply for the United States to get out, not equivocating, not setting timetables, not saying we'll get out if and when. We're not going to go to Paris and negotiate for 5 years or 6 years. We just have to get out. And the arguments against that at that time were the same as the arguments today when people say, as I say, and as a number of people have said, as Congressman Murta, a Vietnam veteran, said, no, we must just leave. We don't belong there. It's not our country. Get out of there. Let the Iraqis determine their own destiny. As difficult as it will be, but we are making it more difficult by our occupation. And the arguments then were the same. Well, we can't do that. There'll be chaos. There'll be chaos in Vietnam? There was chaos in Vietnam. We were bombing Vietnam into eternity. We were destroying Vietnamese villages. We were destroying their land. We were killing their people. Ultimately, 2 million people died in Vietnam, and we mustn't leave because there'll be chaos in Vietnam. So we stayed. We didn't leave. In 1967, when a few of us were calling for withdrawal, we stayed, and what was the result? Another 30,000 American dead, another 1 million Vietnamese dead. And so the same arguments today resonate, we mustn't leave Iraq, as if our presence in Iraq is preventing civil war. The question is our presence preventing civil war, or is our presence provoking civil war? And I think the answer is clear, just looking at a history of these 4 years of our occupation in Iraq. Iraq is a mess after 4 years. And the numbers of Iraqi dead and wounded are enormous, into the hundreds of thousands. So yes, the history is useful. And not the history that you get in the traditional textbooks, but the history that a citizen learns for himself or herself when a citizen goes to the library, or when a citizen listens to the independent media, when a citizen reads alternative journals instead of simply, watching CNN, and Fox News. So yes, history is very useful. It still is today, and I think that one of the things we might learn from history, and this is a very, very important conclusion to get from the long history of this country is that the government's interests are not necessarily the same as ours. In fact, are rarely the same as ours. Because if you think the government's interests are the same as yours, then you think, well, if something is going wrong, it must be that they made a mistake because they really care about us. They don't care about us. The government does not care about its own soldiers. If it did, it would not have sent its soldiers into the quagmires of Vietnam and Iraq. It would not send them into a situation where they're going to come back maimed or without arms or legs, or they come back with their psyche destroyed if they really cared about the soldiers and cared about the families of the soldiers. It would not be taking the wealth of this country and squandering it on $500 billion this year on a military budget. That's a hard thing to grasp, that the government does not have the same interest as us. It's hard to grasp because we grow up in a culture where the language of the culture predisposes us to think, yes, we have a common interest. The Constitution starts off in a preamble, we, the people of the United States, established this. It wasn't we, the people, who established the Constitution. It was 55 rich white men who established the Constitution. I know you're not supposed to say anything about the Founding Fathers. They're our fathers. We're all one family. Not so. The Founding Fathers were slaveholders and merchants and bondholders, really. And sure, they set up a government that was more democratic than other governments in the world. They set up a government that was independent of England, but they did not set up a government that was a government of the people. They set up a slave-holding government that was going to do the interests of the bondholders and the merchants. The interests of the government and the interests of the people right from the beginning were not the same. And that same difference of interest has continued down to the present day. All through look at the history of legislation in this country, it's class legislation. It's legislation that has always benefited the upper classes. There's always been subsidies for the corporations and subsidies for the railroads. They didn't call it welfare. When the government began helping poor people, they called it welfare. When the government gave hundreds of millions of acres of land to the railroads, they didn't call that welfare. But the legislative history of this country is a history of legislation favoring the rich, to put it bluntly. And there were some breakthroughs, there were some oddities, there were some moments in history when this was not true. In the 1930s, something happened. In the 1960s, something happened. What happened is that people rose up all over the country and demanded change. And the demands grew so loud and so threatening that then, in the 1930s, we got Social Security and we got unemployment insurance and we got subsidized housing. And in the 60s, we got Medicare and Medicaid. So there have been moments in our history when the people and their desires and their anguish over their situation has broken through. And then we got legislation that moved away from the traditional upper class legislation of the government. But it is extremely important to understand this conflict of interest between government and us. Otherwise you will think, and the young guy going off to war will think, well, Bush's interest is the same as mine. It's not. Nor is Exxon's interest the same as mine. Nor Halliburton's interest the same as mine. No, that's a very important thing to learn, I think, from history. And when you study the history of the United States, you do not see the kind of country that we all learn about when we go to school, which is a kind of exaltation of America. We're not different, by the way, than other countries. Countries everywhere teach their history in a nationalist way. They're all prideful of their flag and their anthem and, their history. And the United States is no different, except that we're bigger and better and stronger. But we grow up in this country singing the Star-Spangled Banner and, liberty and justice for pledging allegiance and all of that. We grew up with the idea that we are special, we are different, we are the Boy Scouts of the world. We help countries across the street. We're good. We have our little problems, like slavery, maybe. Maybe we weren't nice to the Native Americans. We have our little problems, but basically we're okay. Well, when you look at the history of this country, we were not. We were not. We destroyed Indian civilizations. We expanded into the Caribbean. We expanded into the Pacific. We sent our young people to war again and again. We did not take care of poor people. When poor people organized, and when workers organized into unions and went out on strike, the government called out the police and the National Guard and the Army to suppress their strikes. That's the history of labor struggles in this country.